Picture this: a woman stands perfectly still in the middle of a packed arena. Thousands of people are screaming, her teammates are pulling players apart, referees are blowing whistles so hard their faces turn red, and in the middle of all that noise this one woman just points. She doesn't say a word, she doesn't blink, she just points her finger at another player and she holds it there. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 22 seconds. She becomes a meme before she even leaves the court. Now picture something very different. 2 nights later, same city, same team. A different player is lying flat on the hardwood floor reaching for a loose ball when a fist drives into her throat. No whistle blows, the game keeps going. She gets up holding her neck and nobody around her even realizes what just happened until they watch the replay hours later. 2 moments, 2 nights apart, 1 team. And by the time this story is over, one league will be arguing with itself about who is really being protected, who is really being attacked, and who is telling the truth. This is the story of Sophie Cunningham's silent point and the throat shot that shook the WNBA. Stay with me because this one gets messy fast. To understand why a simple finger point turned into a national headline, and why a foul during a scramble for a basketball turned into death threats, you have to go back further than most people realize. This story didn't start in June of 2026. It started 2 years earlier, the moment one rookie walked onto a WNBA court for the very first time. Her name was Caitlin Clark. Before she ever played a single professional game, she was already the most famous women's basketball player in the country. College fans had watched her pull up from 30 feet away and drain shots that made grown broadcasters gasp. She broke scoring records that had stood for decades. She sold out arenas that used to sit half empty. When she declared for the draft, television ratings for women's basketball exploded overnight. People who had never watched a WNBA game in their life were suddenly setting reminders on their phones. But here's the thing about walking into any professional league as the most hyped rookie in its history. Everybody else in that league has spent years, sometimes a decade or more, grinding for respect that nobody handed them for free. They fought for every contract, every headline, every fraction of the spotlight. And then, almost overnight, a 22-year-old rookie walks in and the cameras follow her before she's played a single quarter. That kind of moment creates tension. It's not something anyone has to invent, it's just human nature. When somebody skips to the front of the line, some of the people already standing there aren't going to smile about it. So when Clark stepped onto the floor for her very first regular season game, the entire basketball world was watching to see how the veterans would respond. They didn't have to wait long. It happened during a dead ball moment, the kind of pause in a game where nothing is supposed to happen at all. The ball wasn't even live. Clark was simply walking toward the inbound spot when a veteran guard named Kennedy Carter came charging across the lane and drove her hip and shoulder straight into Clark's body. Clark went down hard, sprawling onto the floor in front of a stunned crowd. There was no foul called in the moment. It took the league office, reviewing the tape afterward, to upgrade the play to a flagrant foul. That hit lit a fuse that never really went out. Clips of the collision spread across every corner of the internet within hours. Some people said it was simply physical basketball, the normal cost of playing against grown women who had been battling for playing time their whole careers. Other people said it crossed a line, that it was a dead ball cheap shot aimed at a rookie who hadn't done anything except be famous. The debate didn't just stay online. It followed Clark from arena to arena for the rest of the season. Just 1 day after that hip check, in a completely separate and unrelated play, Clark suffered a ruptured eardrum during a collision with a screen set by another veteran player. She didn't even realize the extent of the injury in the moment. She played through it, later telling reporters candidly that it was simply a great screen and her own fault for not hearing her teammates call it out. No malice, no controversy there, just the brutal physical reality of professional basketball. But stacked right on top of the Carter hip check, it added to a growing sense that this rookie's first weeks in the league were going to be a trial by fire. And the hits kept coming throughout that rookie season. In one game, a different opposing player ran her over completely in transition, a full-speed collision that earned another flagrant foul call. Basketball is a physical sport, bodies collide. Nobody is arguing that hard fouls don't happen to everybody. But when they kept happening to the same player over and over, a pattern started to form in the minds of fans, coaches, and eventually the league office itself. Now here's where a second character enters our story. Her name is Sophie Cunningham. She wasn't Clark's teammate yet during that chaotic rookie season. She was actually playing for a different franchise at the time, a team she had spent 6 seasons with before eventually making her way over to Indiana. But once Cunningham did join the Fever, something clicked. She wasn't the kind of player who was going to sit quietly on the bench, while her point guard kept absorbing hit after hit, with no consequences called in real time. Cunningham built a reputation fast. Teammates and fans started calling her the enforcer. If somebody took a shot at Clark, Cunningham was going to be the first one there, and she wasn't going to back down. That reputation didn't stay theoretical for long. During one particularly chaotic game the following season, an opposing player poked Clark in the eye while the two of them were fighting for position. Clark reacted by pushing the player away from her. Almost instantly, another opponent stepped in and shoved Clark to the ground with enough force that she hit the floor hard. That's when Cunningham exploded into action. She delivered a hard foul on the player who had poked Clark in the eye, and within seconds the whole game dissolved into a full-blown fight. Players were shoving, benches were clearing, and by the time officials sorted it all out, 3 players had been ejected from the game entirely. For Fever fans, that moment turned Cunningham into a folk hero overnight. Here was somebody willing to put her own body and her own standing in the league on the line just to protect her point guard. For critics, it looked like exactly the kind of retaliation that makes physical situations even worse. Either way, one thing was now completely clear. Sophie Cunningham had appointed herself as Caitlin Clark's personal bodyguard on the basketball court, and she was not going to be quiet about it. By the time the calendar turned to the season we're focused on now, the pattern around Clark had become impossible to ignore, even for people who didn't follow the sport closely. Every few weeks it felt like there was a new headline, a hard screen here, a shove there, a foul that got reviewed after the fact and upgraded to something more serious. Clark's own head coach, a sharp and outspoken leader named Stephanie White, had started publicly pushing back against the officiating, arguing over and over that her star player was absorbing contact that wouldn't be allowed against anybody else, and that referees simply weren't catching it in real time. And that brings us to the 2 nights that this entire story revolves around. 2 games, 2 nights apart, same opponent both times. One team the Fever were about to face twice in a row was the Phoenix Mercury, a team that, as it turns out, had its own tangled history with both Clark and Cunningham. Cunningham herself had spent 6 years wearing a Mercury jersey before Indiana became her home. And on the Mercury roster now sat a familiar face, a veteran forward named DeWanna Bonner, who had actually been Cunningham's own teammate on the Fever just 1 season earlier, before an awkward, sudden departure sent her back to Phoenix. So when these 2 teams squared off, there was already a strange, layered tension sitting underneath the surface. Old teammates facing off, a superstar rookie who had become the face of the entire league, a self-appointed enforcer determined to protect her, and a veteran roster in Phoenix that had no intention of rolling over just because the cameras were pointed at the other team's jersey. Let's set the scene for Game 1. This was a Monday night matchup, and the building was electric before the opening tip even happened. Everybody in that arena understood what these 2 franchises meant to each other now. Cameras were locked onto Clark the way they always were, ready to catch her next highlight, but also, whether anyone wanted to admit it, ready to catch the next collision. The game itself was tight and physical from the opening minutes, the kind of contest where every whistle mattered and every non-whistle mattered even more. Indiana was fighting for a road win, and Clark was doing what she always did, weaving through defenders, pulling up from deep, drawing extra defenders just by existing on the floor. But basketball games are rarely remembered for their box scores alone. This one would be remembered for something that happened late, in the 4th quarter, in a moment that lasted only a few seconds, but somehow ended up defining an entire week of sports media coverage. Clark and Bonner got tangled up near the basket. It happens constantly in basketball, bodies fighting for position, elbows brushing, feet tangling. In this case, the contact was called as a foul on Clark, and moments later, Clark was hit with a technical foul for clapping her hands and, according to the official explanation, instigating the exchange. If you know anything about Clark's competitive fire, you know she wasn't going to just nod and walk away from that explanation. She challenged it immediately, telling reporters afterward that she'd gone straight to the referee to ask why she'd been given a technical, only to be told it was because she was clapping and instigating. Clark's response, delivered without missing a beat, was that the referee simply didn't like competitive basketball. But the technical foul on Clark wasn't even the most memorable part of that exchange. That distinction belongs entirely to what happened next, and it belongs entirely to Sophie Cunningham. As the tension between Clark and Bonner boiled over, Cunningham was among the very first players to step in between them, doing exactly what her reputation said she would do, inserting herself as a barrier, a protector, a buffer against anything getting worse. But then something shifted. Bonner's attention turned away from Clark and locked directly onto Cunningham. Words were exchanged. Bonner started pointing and jawing at her from across the floor. And this is the moment that turned into one of the strangest, most talked-about scenes of the entire WNBA season. Instead of shouting back, instead of getting in Bonner's face the way you might expect from somebody with Cunningham's reputation as an enforcer, Cunningham did something almost eerily calm. She raised her own finger, pointed it directly back at Bonner, and simply held it there. She didn't say a word, she didn't blink. She just stood, arm extended, finger locked on target, staring Bonner down in complete silence. 10 seconds passed, then 15. Players from both benches were shouting, officials were trying to separate bodies, and in the middle of all that noise and chaos, Cunningham stood like a statue, still pointing, still silent. 20 seconds. Cameras from every angle in the arena found her. Broadcast crews zoomed in, sensing they were capturing something unusual. Finally, at roughly the 22-second mark, a member of the Fever's own staff had to physically guide Cunningham away and steer her back toward the bench, because she simply was not going to stop on her own. By the time the officials finished sorting out the chaos, 5 different players had been issued technical fouls in that single sequence. Clark picked one up, Bonner picked one up, Cunningham picked one up for her silent standoff, and 2 other players from opposing benches, one from each side, picked up a double technical after getting into their own separate confrontation during the same wild sequence. 5 technical fouls from one chain reaction, all sparked by a foul call near the basket that most fans would have forgotten about within minutes, if it weren't for what came right after it. Indiana went on to win that game, 86-77. Under normal circumstances, a solid road win against a divisional opponent might have been the headline the next morning. Instead, every single sports outlet, every highlight show, every social media feed was consumed by 22 seconds of a woman silently pointing her finger and refusing to stop. The clip exploded. It wasn't just basketball fans sharing it anymore. It crossed over into general pop culture within a single day. People who couldn't have named a single WNBA player before that week suddenly knew exactly who Sophie Cunningham was. The image of her, arm locked straight out, finger extended, expression completely blank, became one of those instant internet templates. People edited the photo onto movie posters. People used it to react to completely unrelated news stories. Late-night shows picked it up. It became, almost instantly, one of those rare sports moments that transcends sports entirely and becomes a genuine cultural meme. A few days later, Cunningham addressed the whole thing herself on her own podcast, a show she hosts called Show Me Something. She walked her audience through exactly how the moment started. She explained that it began when she approached an official to ask why Clark had received a technical foul, while Bonner hadn't been given one for her own role in the same exchange. According to Cunningham, she was simply pointing while making her case to the referee, and that's when Bonner turned toward her and warned her not to point at her. Cunningham admitted with a laugh that the second she heard that warning, some competitive switch flipped inside her, and she couldn't help herself. She kept pointing. She said she didn't say a single word the entire time, that all she was doing in her own mind was pointing, but it was clearly working, because Bonner was getting more and more upset by the second. Cunningham didn't pretend the moment was some kind of strategic masterstroke. She openly called it the stupidest thing she had ever done in her life. She laughed about how everyone kept telling her how dumb it looked, and she agreed with them. But she also made it clear that even though she recognized how silly it was, she still felt the technical foul she received, for it was completely unjustified, since in her words all she had done was point, without saying anything at all. There was also a layer of old history simmering underneath that whole exchange with Bonner, history that had nothing to do with basketball plays or technical fouls. Cunningham and Bonner had actually been teammates just one season earlier, both wearing Fever jerseys together, before Bonner left the team partway through that season to sign with Phoenix instead. Cunningham had been vocal about that departure at the time, saying publicly that she wished Bonner had handled the exit more professionally, that a simple respectful message to her teammates would have gone a long way, something as simple as thanking them or wishing them well, rather than the way things actually played out. So by the time these 2 players squared off across the same hardwood again, wearing different coloured jerseys, there was clearly more tension between them than just one contested foul near the basket. Old wounds had never fully healed, And that tension found its outlet in 22 seconds of silent finger, pointing that the entire internet couldn't stop watching. For a few days, that was the whole story. A viral meme. A funny, slightly chaotic moment that made people smile, made people laugh, made people share it with friends who didn't even follow basketball. Cunningham leaned into it herself, posting a series of photos from the moment on her own social media, with a caption made entirely of pointing finger emojis in every direction. Her teammates jumped into the comments. Clark herself replied with nothing but reaction emojis, apparently left speechless by her teammates' newest viral sensation. It was lighthearted. It was fun. It was the kind of moment that makes professional sports feel human and a little bit silly in the best possible way. Nobody watching that clip on a Monday night had any idea that just 2 nights later, on a Wednesday, the exact same two teams would collide again, and this time there would be nothing funny about it at all. Let's slow down here, because what happened in that second game deserves to be walked through carefully, moment by moment, exactly the way it unfolded on the court. The rematch tipped off with even more intensity than the first meeting. Both teams knew exactly what was at stake, and after Monday's chaos, there was an unmistakable edge in the building from the opening tip. This was a back-and-forth battle from the very start, the kind of game where neither team could pull away, where every possession mattered, where the physicality never let up for a single quarter. About halfway through the second quarter, the ball came loose near the basket. In basketball, a loose ball is pure chaos. Bodies dive for it. Elbows fly. Nobody is thinking about anything except getting possession, and in that split second of scrambling, all sorts of incidental contact happens that nobody notices, nobody calls, and nobody remembers 5 minutes later. Clark went down to the floor during that scramble, stretched out, reaching for the ball. And that's when Alyssa Thomas, a veteran Mercury forward known throughout the league for her physical, relentless style of play, ended up tangled directly on top of her. In the chaos of players fighting for that loose ball, Thomas's knee made contact with Clark's thigh. That part alone might have drawn nothing more than a routine whistle in 100 other basketball games. But it's what happened next that changed everything. As Thomas pushed herself up off the floor to get back into the play, her closed fist made contact with Clark's throat. Video of the sequence, once it was reviewed frame by frame later, appeared to show Thomas essentially using Clark's neck and throat area as leverage to push herself upward off the ground. In the moment on the court in real time, with the game moving at full speed and every set of eyes trained on the basketball itself rather than the tangle of bodies underneath it, not a single official blew a whistle. No foul was called. The game simply continued, possession changed, and play rolled forward as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Clark got up. She was clearly in discomfort, holding at her body, but professional athletes get up from awkward falls constantly, and in the flow of a fast-paced game, it didn't immediately register to everyone watching as anything beyond a routine, hard tangle for a loose ball. Clark continued playing. She finished the first half and came back out for the second half, eventually logging 19 points and 8 assists across 20 minutes of action that night, numbers that on their own would represent a strong, productive performance in a hard-fought game. But midway through the second half, Clark exited the game entirely, dealing with what was later described as a back injury, an injury that may well have been aggravated earlier in the game by an entirely separate play, when she landed awkwardly under her own three-point attempt after getting caught under an opposing defender's foot. The final score that night went to Phoenix. The Mercury edged out the Fever, 111-109, in a game that, judging purely by the box score, might have been remembered simply as an entertaining, high-scoring affair between two competitive rosters. Instead, it would go down as one of the most controversial nights of the entire WNBA season, and the reason had almost nothing to do with the final score at all. Here's the part of this story that separates it from 100 other rough basketball plays that happen and get forgotten by the next morning. Nobody in that building, not the Fever coaching staff, not Clark's own teammates, not the broadcast commentary team calling the game live, fully grasped what had actually happened until hours later, when video of the sequence started circulating and people began watching it frame by frame, slowing it down, freezing individual moments. Fever head coach Stephanie White later revealed that she had actually flagged the play to officials at halftime, right after her staff had a chance to review some of the game footage on the sideline. She was told, according to her own post-game comments, that the officials simply hadn't seen it happen in real time. Think about that for a second. A team's own coaching staff had to bring a potentially dangerous play to the attention of the officiating crew during the break, because the play itself had gone completely unnoticed while it was actually happening, buried inside a fast, chaotic scramble for a loose basketball. That revelation alone became a major talking point. If a coaching staff, sitting courtside with access to game footage during a halftime break, needed to specifically point out a play to officials, what did that say about how difficult it truly was to catch dangerous contact in real time, buried inside the ordinary chaos of professional basketball? White didn't hold back when reporters asked her about it after the final buzzer. She argued that this was a much bigger systemic issue than just one missed call in one game. She said the real problem was that officials were locked in on tracking the basketball itself, and nobody was specifically watching the physical battles happening away from the ball, where so much of the real danger in a physical sport actually lives. She pointed out that the league had, to its credit, gone back and reviewed the play using its ability to correct things after the fact, and she was thankful for that. But she made it clear that being thankful for a correction after the game wasn't the same thing as preventing the danger from happening in the first place. In her view, these were things that simply could not be missed in real time, and the fact that they kept slipping through was the actual crisis, not just this one incident in isolation. The following day, the league office did exactly what White had credited them for. They reviewed the sequence frame by frame, and they didn't just call a routine foul after the fact. They upgraded the play all the way to what's known as a flagrant foul 2, the most serious level of flagrant foul a player can receive, reserved for actions considered severe, excessive, or unnecessary enough that if called in the moment, it would result in an automatic ejection from the game. The league's official explanation described the contact as Thomas recklessly making contact with her fist to the throat area of Clark, categorizing the entire sequence as what's called a non-basketball act, meaning it was judged to be separate from any legitimate attempt to make a basketball play. Alongside the flagrant upgrade, Thomas was fined $1,000 and suspended for a full game. Let's pause on how rare that actually is. Since Clark entered the league, there had only been a small handful of flagrant foul 2 calls issued against players who had contact with her, and every single other one of those had been assessed in the moment, during the actual game, leading to an immediate ejection right then and there. This case was different. This one only became a flagrant 2 after the fact, after review, after the damage was already done and the game had already ended. Twice within a stretch of roughly 25 games that Clark had played in, the league ended up acknowledging after the fact that she had absorbed contact serious enough that it should have resulted in an ejection in real time. And in both of those cases, absolutely nothing was called while the game was actually happening. Once that suspension became official news, the story exploded far beyond basketball circles entirely. This wasn't just a sports headline anymore, it became a genuine national conversation. And this is where Sophie Cunningham steps back into the spotlight, because true to the reputation she had built for herself, she was not going to stay quiet about what had happened to her teammate. She went straight to her podcast and let loose. She told her audience that when the actual incident occurred in real time, during the live flow of the game, none of her teammates had actually seen it happen. She explained that if the team had realized in the moment what had actually taken place, they absolutely would have reacted immediately to defend Clark, because that's exactly the kind of team they had built themselves to be. But because the contact was buried inside a chaotic scramble for a loose ball, moving at full basketball speed, none of them caught it until later, when the video started circulating. She didn't stop there. Cunningham argued that this kind of dangerous, uncalled contact against Clark had become a recurring pattern, something that in her words happened every single game, and that the league along with its officiating crews were doing absolutely nothing about it. She specifically referenced footage of players kneeing Clark and delivering what she called cheap shots directly to the throat, arguing that if any other player on their roster had been treated that way, the entire team would have been furious. Her conclusion was blunt and direct. She said that Clark was clearly being targeted, and that the league and its referees simply weren't protecting her. Cunningham's comments landed as a kind of amplification of what her own head coach had already said publicly, just days earlier. Stephanie White had been openly critical of the officiating after the loss, specifically arguing that Clark simply wasn't being called the same way as everybody else on the floor. White had also raised questions about an entirely separate play from that same game, a moment where Clark landed on an opposing defender's foot after a three-point attempt, a type of landing space contact that many people around the league consider to be one of the more dangerous, injury-risking situations in the entire sport. White wanted to know why that play hadn't drawn more scrutiny either. So by this point in our story, you had multiple layers of controversy stacking directly on top of each other. You had the actual contact itself, the fist that made its way to Clark's throat. You had the fact that it went completely uncalled in real time, only getting corrected after the fact through video review. You had a head coach publicly and repeatedly criticizing the entire officiating system as fundamentally broken when it came to protecting her franchise player. And now you had Cunningham, the team's self-declared enforcer, going on a public podcast and accusing the entire league of allowing a pattern of targeted, dangerous contact against Clark to continue unchecked. If you think that's where this story reaches its peak, you'd be wrong. Because the conversation was about to pivot in a direction that almost nobody expected, and it was about to get a whole lot more complicated than a simple debate over one missed foul call. Once the suspension became official and Cunningham's podcast comments started spreading across headlines, something dark began happening away from the basketball court entirely. Alyssa Thomas, the player at the center of the suspension, began receiving a wave of online abuse. According to reports that circulated shortly afterward, Thomas was receiving death threats and racially charged messages across social media platforms. This wasn't isolated criticism of a basketball play anymore. This had crossed into something far more serious and far more dangerous. The kind of online pylon that professional athletes across every sport have increasingly had to deal with whenever they become the center of a viral controversy. Thomas didn't stay silent about what she was experiencing. She went public herself, criticizing the WNBA's commissioner directly, saying that she had learned about her own suspension only about 10 minutes before it became public knowledge across social media, and that she still hadn't heard anything directly from the commissioner's office in the aftermath, despite everything she said she was dealing with. She accused league leadership of abandoning players in moments exactly like this one, arguing that if the league was quick enough to issue a suspension and a fine, it should be equally quick to step up and protect the player receiving death threats as a direct result of that same decision. Thomas's frustration didn't stop at criticizing silence from the top. She and others speaking up around this moment argued that the entire framing of the story had shifted in an unfair direction. Their point was this. For months, the conversation in the WNBA had rightfully focused on protecting Clark, the league's most visible, most marketed, most economically important player, someone who had absorbed hit after hit throughout her young career while officiating struggled to keep up in real time. But the moment a player actually received serious discipline for a dangerous play, some critics argued that the conversation strangely flipped, that instead of continuing to focus on player safety broadly, sympathy suddenly swung toward the player who had thrown the punch, rather than staying focused on the player who had absorbed it. That tension between protecting the league's biggest star and ensuring that the discipline handed down to other players doesn't spiral into targeted, dangerous online harassment became the real center of this entire story in its final act. It stopped being simply a basketball debate about a missed whistle. It became a much larger conversation about how quickly online outrage moves, how little control anyone actually has once a moment goes viral, and how a punishment that the league itself determined was fair and appropriate could still spiral into consequences far beyond anything a locker room fine or a one-game suspension was ever designed to produce. Eventually, the league's commissioner did step forward publicly, issuing a statement condemning the hate and abuse that Thomas had received in the aftermath of her suspension. That statement itself became controversial in its own right, with some observers feeling it arrived only after significant public pressure, and others feeling it was an entirely appropriate and necessary response to a genuinely alarming situation involving threats against a professional athlete's safety. So where does that leave us, at the end of this whirlwind week that started with a silent finger point and ended with death threats splashed across national headlines? It leaves us with a league still trying to figure out how to referee its most physical, most popular, most emotionally charged era in its entire history. It leaves us with a superstar rookie who has now absorbed more flagrant fouls than any other player since she entered the league, 9 of them across just 72 total games, roughly one serious, dangerous incident for every 8 times she stepped onto the floor. It leaves us with a coach who has been consistently, publicly frustrated that her franchise player isn't being protected the way she believes she should be. It leaves us with a self-appointed enforcer whose silent, 22-second stare-down became one of the most shared images of the entire season. A moment of pure, almost comedic tension that briefly made an entire country smile before a far more serious incident swept the same storyline into much darker territory just 2 nights later. And it leaves us with a veteran player who delivered a dangerous, uncalled play, faced serious discipline for it, and then found herself facing threats to her actual safety as a direct result of the exact same viral attention cycle that has turned every single Caitlin Clark-related moment into a nationwide conversation. Nobody walked away from this stretch of basketball looking completely clean. The officials missed a dangerous play in real time, not once but repeatedly across the season, only catching it after the fact through video review. The league handed down discipline that many considered appropriate, only for that same discipline to seemingly fuel a wave of targeted online abuse against the player receiving it. Fans and commentators split sharply down predictable lines, with some rushing to defend Clark's safety above everything else, and others rushing to defend Thomas against what they saw as a disproportionate, dangerous online response to a physical basketball play. And somewhere in the middle of all of that noise stood Sophie Cunningham, pointing her finger in complete silence for 22 unforgettable seconds, a moment that started as nothing more than a heated argument over a missed technical foul, and ended up becoming one of the most viral images in the entire sport. A strange, almost surreal little pocket of levity sitting right in the middle of one of the most serious, most contentious controversies the league had faced in years. If there's one thing this entire stretch of basketball proves, it's how fast a single moment inside a 94-foot basketball court can spiral into something the whole country is talking about. A finger point becomes a meme shared by people who have never watched a single quarter of professional basketball in their lives. A tangle for a loose ball becomes a league-wide safety crisis and a national conversation about online harassment. 2 nights, 2 games, 1 arena. And an entire league left asking the exact same question it had been asking all season long, a question that, even after everything that happened, still didn't have a clean, simple answer. How do you protect your biggest star without losing control of everything and everyone around her? Let's talk for a moment about the noise that surrounded all of this, because the noise itself became part of the story. Within hours of the suspension being announced, timelines everywhere filled up with 2 completely opposite arguments running at full volume at the exact same time. On one side, you had people arguing that the league had finally done the right thing, that a fist to the throat, whether intentional or not, deserved exactly this kind of serious discipline, and that anyone defending the play was simply refusing to admit how dangerous it actually looked on video. On the other side, you had people arguing that basketball is an inherently physical sport, that players dive for loose balls every single night, without a single thought about where their hands or elbows might land, and that turning one chaotic scramble into a suspension and a fine was an overreaction driven entirely by how famous the player on the receiving end happened to be. Both sides had a point buried somewhere inside their argument, and both sides also had plenty of people taking things much too far. That's usually how it goes once a moment escapes the arena and starts living entirely online, where nuance tends to get flattened into whichever side of the argument people already believed before the video even finished loading. Longtime followers of the sport pointed out something else too, something that added even more weight to the whole conversation. Many WNBA veterans had spent years building their careers in relative obscurity, playing in front of half-empty arenas, flying commercial instead of chartering private planes, fighting for basic resources that other professional leagues had taken for granted for decades. Then, almost overnight, a wave of new attention arrived, driven largely by a single electrifying rookie, and with that attention came scrutiny unlike anything the league had ever experienced before. Every foul, every hard screen, every shove near the basket was suddenly being slowed down, zoomed in on, and debated by millions of people who had never watched a possession of women's basketball before that rookie arrived. For some veterans, that scrutiny felt uncomfortable, almost unfair, like their entire careers were now being judged through the narrow lens of how they treated one single player. For others, they simply saw it as the price of a sport finally getting the spotlight it always deserved, even if that spotlight occasionally burned a little too hot. That tension, between celebrating the incredible surge of new attention flooding into the league and resenting the way that same attention seemed to turn every hard foul into a national referendum, sat quietly underneath almost every single conversation about Clark, about Cunningham, about Thomas, and about the officiating crews trying to manage all of it in real time. It's the kind of tension that doesn't resolve itself in a single news cycle. It usually takes years, sometimes entire eras, for a sport to fully adjust to a moment this big. Meanwhile, back on the court, life had to keep moving forward, whether the internet had finished arguing or not. With Clark sidelined by her back injury, the Fever needed other players to step into bigger roles almost immediately. It's easy to forget in the middle of a controversy this loud that professional sports never actually pause for the headlines. Games kept getting scheduled. Practices kept happening. Other players who rarely found themselves in the spotlight suddenly had to carry a heavier load, filling in minutes, filling in shots, filling in leadership, all while reporters kept circling back to ask them questions about a viral finger point and a suspended opponent instead of their own performance on the floor. That's often the hidden cost of a moment this large. The players who had nothing to do with either incident, still, had to walk into locker rooms every single day and answer for a storm they didn't create. And through it all, Cunningham kept doing exactly what she'd always done. She kept showing up. She kept talking. She kept refusing to soften her opinions just because a podcast clip or a courtside moment had suddenly made her one of the most recognizable personalities in the entire league. Whether people loved her for it or rolled their eyes at her for it, nobody could argue that she was staying quiet, and in a story defined almost entirely by contact that went unnoticed and unheard in real time. There was something almost fitting about the loudest, most unmissable personality in the whole saga being the one who never said a single word during her own viral moment. That question isn't going away anytime soon. As long as Caitlin Clark keeps filling arenas, keeps drawing eyes that have never watched women's basketball before, keeps becoming the single most talked about player in the sport's history, every hard foul, every uncalled play, every silent 22-second finger point is going to keep getting magnified into something far bigger than the moment itself ever intended to be. The Fever, the Mercury, the league office, the officials, and millions of fans watching from home are all caught in the middle of the exact same storm, a storm that shows absolutely no signs of slowing down. And if you've made it this far into the story, you already understand why this one moment, out of thousands of plays across an entire season, ended up capturing the attention of an entire country. It wasn't just about basketball anymore. It was about fame, fairness, protection, backlash, and the strange, unpredictable way that a single frozen frame of video, whether it's a silent finger pointed across a basketball court or a fist making contact with someone's throat during a scramble for a loose ball, can end up defining an entire chapter of a sport's history. The story is still being written. Clark is still recovering. Thomas is still facing the fallout from a moment that spiraled far beyond anything a one-game suspension was ever designed to contain. Cunningham is still, somehow, being asked about a finger point in interview after interview. And the league itself is still searching for a way to make sure the next dangerous play gets caught in real time, instead of being discovered hours later, buried inside a highlight reel that an entire country is already replaying frame by frame. 2 nights, 2 games, 1 point that became a meme, 1 punch that became a suspension, and a league still trying to figure out exactly what kind of story it wants to tell about itself in the middle of the most popular, most scrutinized, and most emotionally charged season women's basketball has ever seen.